They say the deepest wounds come from those we love most. I'm 73 years old, and I can tell you that's more than just a saying. It's a truth that cuts straight through to the bone. My name is Lisa Peterson, and I'm about to share with you the most painful chapter of my life. It's the story of how I gave everything to my children, only to discover that in their eyes, I was worth nothing at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened to me could happen to any parent. Maybe it's happening to you right now. Maybe you're making the same mistakes I made, loving so hard and so completely that you forget to save anything for yourself. Or maybe you're on the other side, taking for granted the person who sacrificed everything for your happiness. This isn't just my story. It's a warning wrapped in heartbreak, a lesson learned too late. By the time you hear how this ends, you'll understand why sometimes love isn't enough, and why respect has to be earned even within a family. The autumn leaves were falling the day I realized I had spent 50 years of my life being invisible. It wasn't a sudden revelation, mind you. It crept up on me slowly, like arthritis in winter joints, until one morning I woke up and felt the full weight of what I had become, or rather, what I had never been allowed to be. I was born Lisa Marie Hendricks in 1951, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker. We weren't wealthy, but we had something precious that money can't buy. We had respect for one another. When my mother spoke, my father listened. When my father came home tired from his shift, my mother made sure we children understood that he needed quiet time to decompress. We took care of each other because that's what families do. At least, that's what I thought families did. I met Robert Peterson when I was 19 years old. He was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree and dreams bigger than our small town could contain. He had gentle eyes and strong hands, and when he looked at me, I felt like I was the only woman in the world. We married 2 years, later in a simple ceremony at the Methodist church, with white roses from my mother's garden and a cake she baked herself. Those early years were golden. Robert worked his way up at the regional bank while I taught elementary school. We lived in a tiny apartment above the hardware store, but it felt like a palace because we were building something together. We talked about children, about buying a house, about growing old together on a porch swing. We had plans, dreams, a whole future mapped out in conversations that lasted deep into the night. Sarah came first, born in the spring of 1973. I remember holding her for the first time, this perfect tiny person who shared my nose and Robert's stubborn chin. 2 years later came Michael, followed by Emma in 1979. 3 beautiful children who filled our small house with laughter and chaos and so much love, I thought my heart might burst from the fullness of it. Then Robert died. It was February 14th, 1983, Valentine's Day, though I've never been able to celebrate that holiday since. He had been complaining of chest pains for a few days, but he was only 34. Young men don't have heart attacks, we told ourselves. It was probably just stress from work, maybe pulled muscles from helping his brother move furniture the weekend before. I was getting the children ready for school when I heard the thud from our bedroom. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. Just like that, in the span of a heartbeat, I went from being a wife and mother to being a widow and the sole provider for 3 children who couldn't understand why Daddy wouldn't wake up. The grief was a living thing that took up residence in my chest. Some days it felt like I was drowning in it, gasping for air in a world that suddenly made no sense. But children don't stop needing things just because your world has ended. They still needed breakfast and clean clothes and help with homework. They needed bedtime stories and Band-Aids for scraped knees and someone to tell them everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. So I learned to compartmentalize my pain. I saved my tears for late at night, after the children were asleep, when I could finally let the mask slip and remember what it felt like to be Robert's wife, instead of just Sarah and Michael and Emma's mother. During the day, I was whatever. They needed me to be cheerleader at school events, nurse when they were sick, disciplinarian when they misbehaved, provider when they needed things we couldn't afford. The life insurance money helped for a while, but it wasn't enough to live on indefinitely. I had to go back to work, leaving my job at the elementary school for something that paid better. I found work as a secretary at the county courthouse, filing papers and answering phones for men who barely acknowledged my existence beyond the tasks I performed for them. Every morning, I got the children ready for school, dropped them off, worked 8 hours dealing with other people's problems, picked up groceries, came home to cook dinner, helped with homework, did laundry, cleaned house, and fell into bed, exhausted, only to wake up and do it all again the next day. Weekends were for soccer games and dance recitals and birthday parties, always someone else's birthday party because we couldn't afford to throw the kind of celebrations other families took for granted. I learned to say no to myself so I could say yes to them. When Sarah wanted to take piano lessons, I gave up my subscription to the one magazine I enjoyed. When Michael needed new soccer cleats, I wore shoes with cardboard covering the holes in the soles for another 6 months. When Emma begged for art supplies, I skipped lunch at work for 2 weeks to save the money. They were good children, truly. Sarah was serious and studious, always bringing home perfect report cards and teacher comments about what a pleasure she was to have in class. Michael was my sensitive one, the artist who saw beauty in everything and could make me laugh even on the hardest days. Emma was pure sunshine, the kind of child who made friends with everyone and collected stray animals the way other children collected baseball cards. As they grew older, I took on extra work to pay for the things they needed. I cleaned offices, on weekends, babysat for neighbors, took in sewing jobs that kept me up until 2 in the morning. When Sarah wanted to go to college, I worked 3 jobs to help pay her tuition. When Michael decided he wanted to study music, I found the money for private lessons with the best teacher in the county. When Emma showed talent for dance, I somehow managed to afford the costumes and competition fees and gas money for all those weekend tournaments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I told myself it was worth it every time I saw their faces light up with achievement. Sarah graduated summa cum laude and went on to law school. Michael earned a music scholarship and became a high school band director. Emma got into a prestigious dance program and eventually opened her own studio. I was so proud of them, so grateful that despite growing up without a father, they had turned into accomplished, successful adults. The years flew by in a blur of graduations and job interviews and wedding plans. Sarah married David, a fellow lawyer, in a ceremony that cost more than I made in 6 months. I didn't complain about the expense because I wanted her day to be perfect. Michael married his college sweetheart Jennifer, in a smaller but equally lovely ceremony. Emma went through a series of relationships before finally settling down with Marcus, a man who shared her love of the arts. I should have been the happiest woman alive. My children were successful, settled, starting families of their own. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The regular phone calls became weekly, then monthly. The Sunday dinners at my house became occasional holidays. The easy intimacy we had shared when they were younger gave way to polite conversations about weather and work. I told myself it was natural. Children grow up and build their own lives. That's what parents want, isn't it? For their children to be independent and successful? But the loneliness was a constant ache, and I began to realize that in spending all those years being their mother, I had forgotten how to be anything else. My house felt cavernous without their voices filling it. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Robert's parents had given us as a wedding gift. I tried to fill the emptiness with hobbies, with volunteer, work, with anything that would make me feel useful again. But nothing quite worked. I had defined myself so completely by my role as their mother that without them needing me, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. The phone calls that did come were usually requests. Could I babysit the grandchildren? Could I loan them money for a down payment? Could I help with this or that project? I said yes to everything because it felt good to be needed again, even if it was only for my usefulness rather than my company. I began to notice that our conversations followed a pattern. They would ask about my health. I would assure them I was fine. And then they would move on to talking about their own lives. They rarely asked about my interests, my friends, my hopes for the future. It was as if I existed solely in relation. To them, a satellite orbiting their bright stars. Sarah's career took off and she moved to a bigger city 2 hours away. Michael got promoted and had to travel frequently for work. Emma's dance studio grew more successful and demanding. They were all so busy, so important, so needed by others. And I was proud of them, truly. But I also began to feel like I was watching their lives from the outside. Like I was no longer part of their stories, but merely a footnote in their histories. The grandchildren came, and for a while, I thought things might change. Surely they would need their grandmother now, someone to spoil the babies and pass down family traditions. And they did need me, but only when it was convenient for them. I became the emergency babysitter, the one they called when their regular childcare fell through, or when they wanted a weekend getaway. I loved those grandchildren with the same fierce intensity I had loved my own children. Little Jacob with Sarah's serious eyes, Michael's twin boys who inherited their father's musical talent, Emma's daughter who moved like poetry in motion just like her mother. But even my relationships with them were filtered through their parents, limited to the time and circumstances their parents deemed appropriate. The years continued to pass, and I watched my friends lose their spouses and struggle with the same loneliness I felt. We supported each other as best we could, but there's something uniquely painful about feeling invisible to the people you love most. I had given them everything I had to give, and somehow it had never been enough to earn me a permanent place in their adult lives. I tried talking to them about it once. It was during one of our increasingly rare family dinners, and I had worked up the courage to say that I missed them, that I wished we talked more often. Sarah patted my hand and said she understood, but she was working on an important case. Michael nodded sympathetically and promised to call more often, but his phone rarely rang with anything but requests. Emma hugged me and said we should plan a girls' day soon, but weeks went by without her following through. They heard my words but didn't really listen. They saw my sadness but didn't understand its depth. And maybe that was my fault. Maybe I had trained them so well to take my sacrifice for granted that they couldn't imagine I might need something in return. As I approached my 70th birthday, I began to realize that this was probably how the rest of my life would unfold. I would age gracefully in my empty house, getting occasional visits from children who saw me as a duty rather than a joy. I would be the sweet little old lady who had pictures of grandchildren, but rarely saw them except in carefully orchestrated holiday gatherings. I would be grateful for whatever crumbs of attention they threw my way, because I had never taught them that I deserved more. The thought terrified me more than death itself. I had spent my entire adult life pouring myself into other people, and I was starting to understand that I might end up completely empty, with nothing left of the woman I had once been or might have become. But I still believed, in that naive way that mothers do, that love would find a way. That somehow, some way they would wake up and realize that I was more than just a resource to be tapped when needed. I believed that our bond was stronger than their busy schedules and competing priorities. I believed right up until Emma's wedding day, when I learned exactly how much I meant to the children I had sacrificed everything to raise. That was the day my last illusions died, and with them, any hope I had for the kind of relationship I had always dreamed of having with my grown children. That was the day I realized that sometimes a mother's love isn't enough. Sometimes it's not even noticed, and sometimes The people you would die for wouldn't even pause their own lives long enough to catch you if you fell. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That revelation, that moment of absolute clarity that changed everything, was still months away. At this point in my story, I was still the hopeful mother, still believing that things would get better, that my children would eventually see me as more than just a convenient accessory to their own lives. I was still making excuses for them, still finding ways to rationalize their neglect. Sarah was busy with her partnership track at the law firm. Michael was overwhelmed with teaching and his own family responsibilities. Emma was building her business and planning her wedding. They all had such important, demanding lives. Of course, they didn't have much time for their aging mother. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. I had made myself indispensable when they were young, and now that they were grown, they had learned to live quite well without me. I had taught them to take my devotion for granted, and they had learned that lesson perfectly. But mothers are eternal optimists when it comes to their children. We believe in their goodness even when evidence suggests otherwise. We make excuses for their shortcomings and magnify their smallest gestures of affection. We convince ourselves that, deep down, they love us as much as we love them, even when their actions suggest something quite different. So I continued to hope. I continued to answer every phone call with enthusiasm, to say yes to every request for help, to pretend that the scraps of attention they threw my way were enough to sustain me. I continued to believe that being a good mother meant never asking for anything in return, never expressing disappointment or hurt, never making my children feel guilty for living their own lives. I was about to learn that being too good a mother can be the cruelest thing you can do, both to yourself and to your children. I was about to discover that unconditional love, when it flows in only one direction, becomes a prison for everyone involved. But that lesson was still waiting for me on a dance floor at a wedding reception, where I would sit alone at a table while my children celebrated with everyone but me. That was where I would finally understand that I had spent 50 years making myself smaller and smaller until I had practically disappeared from my own life. That was where everything would change, where the woman I had buried under decades of selfless motherhood would finally claw her way back to the surface and demand to be seen. That was where Lisa Peterson, the individual, would be reborn from, the ashes of Lisa Peterson, the perpetual mother. But first, I had to hit rock bottom. I had to experience the ultimate rejection, the final proof that all my years of sacrifice had earned me nothing more than a place at the margins of their lives. I had to feel the full weight of their indifference before I could find the strength to change everything. The wedding was coming. Emma's perfect day that I had helped plan and pay for. My youngest child, my baby, was finally getting married, and I was looking forward to it with a mixture of joy and anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. Surely this would be different. Surely on such an important day I would be more than just another guest. Surely they would remember that I was the one who had made all their happiness possible. I was about to learn just how wrong a mother could be. Emma's engagement to Marcus came as no surprise to anyone who knew them. They had been together for 3 years, and you could see the way he looked at her like she hung the moon and stars just for him. He was a good man, steady and kind, with a successful career in graphic design that complemented Emma's artistic nature perfectly. When he asked for my blessing before proposing, I was touched that he still believed in such old-fashioned courtesies. The proposal itself was everything Emma had ever dreamed of. Marcus arranged for it to happen at the botanical gardens where they had their first date, surrounded by the same blooming roses that had provided the backdrop for their early romance. Emma called me that evening, breathless with excitement, describing every detail from the ring to the surprise tears to the way Marcus had quoted her favorite poem before getting down on one knee. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely included in one of my children's major life events. Emma wanted my help with the wedding planning, my opinion on venues and flowers and dress styles. She valued my experience, my connections in town, my ability to stretch a budget without sacrificing elegance. We spent hours together poring over bridal magazines, visiting potential reception halls, tasting cakes, and comparing photographers. Those months of wedding preparation were some of the happiest I had experienced since my children were small. Emma would come over every Sunday afternoon, and we would spread wedding plans across my dining room table like generals plotting a campaign. She listened when I shared stories about my own wedding, asked questions about family traditions she wanted to incorporate, and genuinely seemed to care about my thoughts and feelings. I felt useful again, needed for more than just my wallet or my babysitting services. Emma treated me like a partner in creating her perfect day, not just a convenient resource to be tapped when necessary. For the first time in years, I began to believe that maybe I had been wrong about my children's feelings toward me. Maybe I had misinterpreted their busyness as indifference, their independence as rejection. The wedding itself was planned for October, when the autumn leaves would provide a natural backdrop of gold and crimson for the photographs. Emma wanted an outdoor ceremony in the garden behind the historic mansion on the edge of town, followed by a reception in the mansion's ballroom. It was ambitious and expensive, but she had saved diligently, and Marcus's family was contributing generously. I offered to help with whatever they needed, both financially and practically. As the date approached, I found myself more excited than I had been about anything in years. This wasn't just Emma's wedding. It felt like a celebration of our renewed closeness, a symbol of the relationship we had rebuilt during those months of planning together. I had helped choose the flowers, recommended the caterer, even contributed to the cost of the photographer. I felt like a true partner in creating this magical day. I spent weeks searching for the perfect mother-of-the-bride dress, finally settling on an elegant navy blue creation that was sophisticated without being too flashy. I didn't want to upstage the bride, but I also wanted to look like I belonged at such a beautiful celebration. I made an appointment to have my hair done at the same salon Emma was using, bought new shoes that were comfortable enough for dancing, and even treated myself to a manicure. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that photographers dream about. I arrived early at the mansion to help with any last-minute preparations, bringing the emergency kit I had assembled with safety pins and stain remover and aspirin for any wedding day crises that might arise. Emma was radiant in her dress, a confection of silk and lace that made her look like a fairy tale princess. Sarah and Michael had arrived the night before with their families, and for the first time in years, all of my children were under the same roof. The house felt alive again with their voices and laughter, with grandchildren running through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. I allowed myself to hope that maybe this wedding would mark a new beginning for our family, a return to the closeness we had once shared. The ceremony was everything Emma had dreamed of and more. She and Marcus exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and grow old together surrounded by love and laughter. I cried during the service, tears of joy for Emma's happiness, but also tears of memory. For my own wedding day so many years ago, when I had made similar promises to Robert with no idea how short our time together would be. As the bride and groom walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in years. My youngest child was settled and happy, married to a man who clearly adored her. All three of my children had grown into successful, accomplished adults who were contributing positively to the world. Despite the struggles and sacrifices of those early years, I had succeeded in my most important job. The cocktail hour before dinner was a whirlwind of congratulations and small talk with relatives and family friends I hadn't seen in years. Everyone wanted to tell me how beautiful Emma looked, how lovely the ceremony had been, how proud I must be of all my children. I basked in their compliments and felt for the first time in a long time like I was seen and appreciated for the role I had played in creating this happiness. When we moved into the ballroom for dinner, I was surprised to discover that I had been seated at the family table with my children and their spouses. Usually at events like this, I found myself relegated to a table with elderly relatives or family friends, pleasant enough company, but not the inner circle where important family conversations took place. Tonight felt different. Tonight, I was being included as a central figure in the celebration. The dinner was excellent, a carefully planned menu that reflected Emma's attention to detail and good taste. The conversation flowed easily, with stories about Emma's childhood, jokes about Marcus's initial nervousness around the family, and reminiscences about other family weddings and celebrations. I felt relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't in years, surrounded by my children and their families, included in their laughter and affection. Sarah's husband David told the story of the first time he met me, how nervous he had been to get my approval, and how I had put him at ease by asking about his work and genuinely listening to his answers. Michael's wife Jennifer shared her memory of our first Christmas together, when I had somehow managed to make her feel like part of the family from the moment she walked through the door. These weren't just polite dinner conversation stories. They were genuine expressions of appreciation for the effort I had made to welcome their spouses into our family. For the first time in years, I felt like I was being seen as a complete person, rather than just a mother figure. They were acknowledging not just what I had done for them as children, but who I was as an individual, the qualities that made me someone worth knowing and spending time with. The recognition felt like warm sunshine after a long winter. When the dancing began, Marcus made a point of asking me for the traditional mother-in-law dance, spinning me around the floor with genuine warmth and telling me how grateful he was to be joining our family. Emma cut in halfway through the song, and we danced together the way we used to when she was little, when she would stand on my feet and I would waltz her around the living room to music only we could hear. The evening felt magical in a way I hadn't experienced since my children were young. I was part of the celebration, not just observing it from the sidelines. I was contributing to their joy, not just witnessing it. I was included in their world, not just supporting it from the outside. For the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged. As the evening progressed, the grandchildren grew tired and cranky, as small children do at late-night celebrations. Sarah mentioned that David's parents had offered to take Jacob home early so he could get to bed at a reasonable hour. Michael said that Jennifer's sister had volunteered to drive the twins back to their hotel so they wouldn't be completely exhausted the next day. Even Marcus's parents were talking about leaving soon, since they had an early flight the next morning. I didn't think much of it at first. Weddings are long events, and it's natural for older guests and families with small children to leave before the very end. I was actually impressed by how long everyone had stayed, how much they had clearly enjoyed the celebration. The dance floor was still crowded with Emma's friends and younger relatives, the bar was still busy, and the bride and groom showed no signs of slowing down. But then Sarah came over to where I was sitting, having taken a break from dancing to rest my feet. She looked apologetic but determined, the expression she had worn as a child when she had to deliver news she knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Mom, I'm sorry, but David and I are going to head out soon," she said, her voice barely audible over the music. "We promised Jacob's sitter we'd be back by 10, and it's already past 9. You know how he gets when his routine is disrupted." I nodded understandingly, though I felt a small pang of disappointment. It was Emma's wedding, after all, and I had hoped we could all stay until the very end, savoring this rare opportunity to be together as a complete family. But I understood the realities of parenting young children, the need to maintain schedules and routines even during special occasions. "Of course, dear," I said, reaching up to squeeze her hand. "Thank you for staying as long as you did. Jacob has been such a good boy today." A few minutes later, Michael appeared at my other side with a similar expression of regret. "Mom, I hate to do this, but Jennifer and I need to leave too. She's been feeling nauseous all evening, and we think she might be coming down with something. We don't want to risk getting anyone else sick." Again, I nodded and smiled, though the disappointment was growing stronger. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell Jennifer I hope she feels better soon. Thank you both for being here today. I watched as Sarah and Michael made their rounds, saying goodbye to Emma and Marcus, hugging other relatives, collecting their children and spouses, and preparing to leave. The family table that had felt so warm and inclusive just an hour earlier was suddenly much emptier, with only Emma and Marcus remaining, and they were busy circulating among their other guests. I told myself it was fine. Weddings are exhausting, and people have their own responsibilities and limitations. Sarah had legitimate childcare concerns, and Michael's wife was feeling unwell. These were reasonable excuses for leaving early, not personal rejections of me or the celebration. I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into normal family logistics. But as I sat there watching my children gather their belongings and shepherd their families toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this picture. At my own wedding, nearly 50 years ago, both sets of parents had stayed until the very last dance, until the bride and groom departed for their honeymoon. They had considered it their honor and responsibility to see the celebration through to its conclusion. Maybe things were different now. Maybe modern. Families had different expectations, different priorities. Maybe I was being old-fashioned in thinking that families should stick together for the entire celebration, that being present for your sister's wedding meant more than just attending the ceremony and having dinner. Emma came over to say goodbye to her siblings, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes, even though she was trying to hide it behind her bride's smile. This was her wedding day, the celebration she had been planning for months, and her family was leaving while there. Were still hours left to dance and laugh and create memories together. I understand, she said as she hugged Sarah goodbye. Jacob needs his sleep, and Jennifer needs to take care of herself. Thank you for being here for the ceremony. That's what really mattered. But I could hear the hurt in her voice, the same hurt I was feeling as I watched my family dissolve, just when the celebration should have been reaching its peak. We were all saying the right words, making the appropriate excuses, but underneath the polite understanding was a current of disappointment that none of us wanted to acknowledge. After Sarah and Michael left with their families, the dynamics of the evening shifted noticeably. Emma and Marcus were busy with their remaining guests, most of whom were their friends and colleagues rather than family members. I found myself sitting alone at the family table, watching the celebration continue around me but no longer feeling like a central part of it. The music was still playing, couples were still dancing, people were still laughing and celebrating. But without my other children there, I felt like I was observing the party from the outside rather than participating in it. The magical feeling of inclusion and belonging that had sustained me through the earlier part of the evening began to fade, replaced by a familiar sense of being on the periphery of other people's happiness. I tried to mingle with the remaining guests, making small talk with Emma's friends and Marcus's relatives. Everyone was polite and kind, complimenting me on how beautiful Emma looked and how lovely the wedding had been. But these were Emma's people, not mine. They had their own conversations to have, their own relationships to maintain, their own good times to pursue. As the evening wore on, I became increasingly aware that I was the only member of Emma's immediate family still present, besides the bride and groom themselves. All the other parents had either left early or were occupied with their own social circles. I was the lone representative of Emma's childhood, the only person there who remembered her first steps and first words, and first day of school. The responsibility felt both meaningful and isolating. I was proud to be there for Emma, to represent our family's love and support for her new marriage. But I was also acutely aware that I was alone in that role, that the burden of family representation had fallen entirely on my shoulders because everyone else had found reasons to be elsewhere. By 10 o'clock, the crowd had thinned considerably. Many of the older guests had departed, leaving primarily Emma's contemporaries and their friends. The music had shifted to more contemporary songs that I didn't recognize. The dancing had become more energetic and less formal, and the conversation had grown louder and more animated as people relaxed and let loose. Emma was radiant, glowing with happiness as she danced with her new husband and celebrated with her friends. Marcus was equally joyful, clearly thrilled to be married to the woman he adored and surrounded by people who cared about them both. They were having the time of their lives, and I was genuinely happy for them. But I was also increasingly conscious of being the only person there who didn't quite fit into their generation or their social circle. The conversations around me were about jobs and relationships and experiences that I had no context for. The music was from artists I had never heard of. Even the humor was often lost on me, references to movies and television shows and cultural phenomena that had passed me by. I didn't want to be the elderly mother who overstayed her welcome, who clung to the party long after her presence was needed or appreciated. I had always prided myself on knowing when to gracefully exit, when to step back and let my children live their own lives without my interference. But I also didn't want to abandon Emma on her wedding night, to leave her without any family support, during one of the most important celebrations of her life. The dilemma felt familiar, a variation on the same theme that had defined my relationship with my adult children for years. How much involvement was too much? How much distance was too little? Where was the line between being a supportive mother and being an intrusive one? I had never quite figured out the answer, and tonight the question felt particularly acute. I decided to stay until 11, giving Emma at least one family member present for the majority of her reception. I found a quiet corner where I could observe the celebration without getting in anyone's way, nursing a glass of wine and watching my youngest daughter dance and laugh with the people who mattered most to her. But as the clock approached 11, something happened that changed everything. Emma and Marcus came over to where I was sitting, both of them flushed and happy from dancing, and Emma sat down beside me with the kind of serious expression that meant she had something important to say. "Mom," she began, taking my hand in hers, "Marcus and I have been talking, and we've decided we want to go back to our hotel room soon. We're both exhausted, and we want to have some time alone together before we collapse completely." I nodded, understanding completely. Of course they wanted privacy on their wedding night. Of course they were tired after such a long, emotional day. It was natural and appropriate for them to want to wind down the celebration and begin their married life together. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, squeezing her hand. "You've had such a beautiful day, and you deserve to savor it together. I'm so happy for you both." Emma smiled, but then her expression grew more complicated. "The thing is, Mom, some of our friends are talking about continuing the party at the hotel bar. Not a big thing, just a small group who aren't ready to call it a night yet. And Marcus and I were thinking we might stop by for just a little while before we go upstairs." I felt my stomach begin to tighten, sensing where this conversation was heading, but hoping I was wrong. "That sounds lovely, dear. I'm sure your friends want to keep celebrating with you." "The thing is," Emma continued, and now she wasn't quite meeting my eyes, "it's going to be a pretty small group. Just our closest friends, really. People we went to college with, people from work. You know, our peer group." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though they were delivered gently. I understood what she was telling me without her having to say it explicitly. I was not part of their peer group. I was not among their closest friends. I was not invited to continue the celebration. "I understand," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "You want to celebrate with people your own age. That makes perfect sense." Emma looked relieved, but also guilty, as if she knew she was hurting me, but couldn't bring herself to do anything different. "You understand, don't you, Mom? It's not that we don't want you there. It's just that it's going to be a different kind of celebration. More casual, more relaxed. You'd probably be bored." I nodded and smiled, falling back into the familiar pattern of making things easier for my children even when it cost me something important. "Of course I understand, sweetheart. You go have fun with your friends. You've earned the right to celebrate however you want." Marcus squeezed my shoulder affectionately. "Thank you for being so understanding, Lisa. And thank you for everything you did to help make today so perfect. Emma and I both appreciate it more than we can say." They were both trying to be kind, trying to let me down gently. But kindness couldn't change the fundamental reality of what was happening. On my daughter's wedding day, after months of planning together, after feeling more included and valued than I had in years, I was being dismissed so that the real celebration could begin without me. I gathered my purse and gave Emma and Marcus each a long hug, telling them again how happy I was for them and how beautiful the wedding had been. I thanked the remaining guests who were near enough to speak to, complimented the vendors who were cleaning up, and made my way to the parking lot where my car waited alone under the dim security lights. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I tried to process what had just happened. On the surface, everything Emma and Marcus had said was reasonable. They were tired. They wanted time with their friends. They were beginning their married life together. These were normal, healthy desires that I should support as a loving mother. But underneath the surface, something much more painful had occurred. I had been relegated to the role of helpful bystander, useful for the planning and preparation, but not essential for the actual celebration. I had been thanked for my contributions and then politely dismissed when my presence was no longer needed or desired. The pattern was so familiar it made my chest ache. I was the mother who was called when help was needed but forgotten when fun was being had. I was the family member who was appreciated for what I could provide, but not valued for who I was as a person. I was the woman who had spent her entire adult life making herself indispensable to her children, only to discover that they had learned to live quite well without her. When I reached my empty house, I sat in my car for a long time, before going inside. The silence felt oppressive after the music and laughter of the wedding reception. The darkness felt heavy after the warm lights and joyful celebration I had just left behind. I felt like I was returning to exile after a brief, tantalizing taste of inclusion. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table, still wearing my beautiful mother of the bride dress, but feeling anything but beautiful. The house was full of reminders of the wedding preparation, fabric samples and menu cards and flower arrangements we had chosen together. Evidence of the partnership I had thought Emma and I were building, the relationship I had believed was growing stronger. But tonight had made it clear that our partnership had been temporary, limited to the planning phase of her wedding. Once the actual celebration began, once it was time for the real joy and intimacy and connection, I was no longer needed. I was the supporting cast, not the leading lady. I was the helper, not the beloved. The realization settled over me slowly, like fog rolling in from the ocean. This wasn't just about Emma's wedding night. This was about the fundamental nature of my relationships with all my children. I was useful to them, valued for what I could do and provide, but I wasn't essential to their happiness. I wasn't someone they chose to spend time with. I was someone they felt obligated to include out of duty and politeness. I thought about Sarah leaving early because of childcare concerns, even though Jacob's grandparents were perfectly capable babysitters who would have loved to extend their evening with their grandson. I thought about Michael citing Jennifer's illness, even though she had seemed fine during dinner and had only mentioned feeling tired, not sick. I thought about Emma's careful explanation of why I wouldn't fit in with her friends, delivered with love, but devastating in its implications. They had all found reasons to minimize their time with me, to prioritize other people and other concerns over spending a full evening celebrating together as a family. And I had made it easy for them by being understanding, by accepting their explanations, by never asking for more than they were willing to give. I had trained them, over decades of selfless motherhood, to take my love for granted while never requiring them to love me back with the same intensity. I had taught them that my needs were less important than theirs, that my happiness was secondary to their convenience, that my presence was optional while my support was mandatory. The wine tasted bitter in my mouth as I contemplated the rest of my evening. Emma and Marcus were probably at the hotel bar now, laughing with their friends, creating memories that didn't include me. Sarah and Michael were home with their families, having moved on from the wedding to their own domestic concerns, and I was alone in my empty house, wearing a dress that had been chosen to make me feel special at a celebration that had ultimately reminded me of how peripheral I had become to my children's lives. This was my reward for 50 years of devoted motherhood. This was what unconditional love had earned me. This was the return on my investment of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched and dream deferred. I was tolerated, not treasured. I was included out of obligation, not desire. I was appreciated for my usefulness, not loved for my essence. The knowledge was devastating not because it was sudden, but because it was so clearly true. Tonight had simply made visible what had been building for years, the gradual transformation of my role from beloved mother to convenient helper. I had been relegated to the margins of their lives so gradually that I hadn't noticed until I found myself sitting alone at a wedding reception, watching my children choose everyone else over me. As I finally changed out of my beautiful dress and prepared for bed, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being understanding. I was done making excuses for their behavior. I was done accepting crumbs of attention and pretending. They were enough to sustain me. I was 73 years old, and I had spent enough years being invisible. It was time for my children to learn that love and respect are not one-way streets, and that taking someone for granted has consequences. It was time for them to discover what life would be like without their devoted, understanding, always available mother. It was time for Lisa Peterson to stop being a doormat and start being a woman who demanded the treatment she deserved. And if my children couldn't give me that treatment willingly, then perhaps they needed to learn to do without me entirely. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. But as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my empty bedroom, I knew that Emma's wedding night had marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The era of unconditional availability was over. The era of consequences was about to begin. The morning after Emma's wedding, I woke up feeling like I had been hit by a truck. Not physically, though my feet ached from the dancing and my head was slightly fuzzy from the wine. The real pain was deeper, settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous evening over and over, each memory bringing a fresh wave of humiliation. I had been so naive, so hopeful. For months, I had convinced myself that Emma and I were building something special during the wedding planning. I had interpreted her requests for help as genuine desire for my company, her questions about family traditions as respect for my wisdom and experience. I had actually believed that I was important to her beyond my ability to write checks and provide free labor. The truth was so much more painful. I had been useful during the planning phase because she needed my organizational skills, my local connections, my financial contributions. But when it came time for the actual celebration, when it was about joy and intimacy and creating memories with the people who truly mattered to her, I was expendable. I was the hired help who could be dismissed once the real party began. I made myself get up and shower, trying to wash away the lingering embarrassment of the night before. As I stood under the hot water, I found myself analyzing every interaction from the wedding, looking for signs I should have noticed earlier. Sarah's polite but distant conversation during dinner. Michael's quick hugs that felt more obligatory than affectionate. Emma's careful management of my involvement, always directing me toward helpful tasks rather than meaningful participation. They had all been going through the motions of including me while actually keeping me at arm's length. They had performed the role of loving children while protecting themselves from having to actually engage with me as a person worth spending time with. And I had been so grateful for even that much attention that I had missed the fundamental coldness underneath, their politeness. After my shower, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the newspaper, trying to establish some normalcy in my morning routine. But the silence in the house felt different now, heavier with the weight of new understanding. This wasn't just the quiet of an empty nest. This was the silence of genuine loneliness, of being forgotten by the people who should have cared most about my well-being. The phone rang around 10 o'clock, and I saw Emma's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe she was calling to apologize for the way the evening had ended. Maybe she had realized how hurtful it had been to exclude me from the after-party. Maybe she wanted to make amends and find a way to rebuild the closeness I thought we had been developing. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered, keeping my voice cheerful despite the turmoil in my chest. "Hi, Mom." Emma's voice was bright but rushed, the tone of someone checking an item off a to-do list. "I just wanted to call and thank you again for everything you did to make yesterday so perfect. Marcus and I both said this morning that we couldn't have done it without you." The words should have been gratifying, but they felt hollow. She was thanking me for my contributions, not expressing any regret about how the evening had ended for me. She was acknowledging my usefulness without recognizing my hurt. "I'm so glad you had a wonderful day," I replied, and I meant it. Despite my own pain, I genuinely wanted Emma to be happy. "You looked absolutely radiant, and Marcus is such a good man. I'm thrilled for you both." "We're about to head to the airport for our honeymoon," Emma continued, "but I wanted to make sure I called to say thank you before we left." "Oh, and Mom, could you do me a huge favor? I left my jewelry box in the bridal suite at the mansion, and they said family could pick it up anytime today. Would you mind grabbing it for me? I'll get it from you when we get back from Hawaii." And there it was. Even on the morning after her wedding, even during what should have been a conversation about our relationship and the events of the previous evening, Emma was asking me to perform a task for her convenience. She wasn't calling because she missed me or wanted to connect with me. She was calling because she needed something done. "Of course, dear," I heard myself say, falling automatically into the familiar pattern of helpfulness. "I'll go get it this afternoon and keep it safe until you return." "You're the best, Mom. I have to run now, but I'll call you when we get back. Love you." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone and staring at the wall. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes, just long enough for her to express perfunctory gratitude and assign me another errand. There had been no acknowledgement of how the evening had ended, no recognition that I might have feelings about being excluded from her celebration with friends. I sat there for a long time, processing the interaction and what it revealed about Emma's priorities. Even on her honeymoon departure day, she had found time to call me not to connect emotionally, but to delegate a task. I was her personal assistant, not her beloved mother. I was a resource to be managed, not a relationship to be cherished. The realization was crystallizing into something harder and more determined than the hurt I had felt the night before. This wasn't just about Emma's wedding or one thoughtless evening. This was about a fundamental dynamic that had developed in all my relationships with my children, a pattern where I gave everything and they took it for granted while giving back only what was convenient for them. I decided to drive to the mansion to retrieve Emma's jewelry box, but I took my time getting ready. For years, I had dropped everything whenever one of my children needed something, racing to accommodate their requests as if their needs were always more urgent than whatever I might be doing. Today, I finished my coffee, read the newspaper thoroughly, and even took a short walk around the neighborhood before getting in my car. The mansion looked different in the morning light, more ordinary without the romantic glow of wedding decorations and evening lighting. Workers were cleaning up the remnants of the reception, loading rental chairs and taking down string lights. The magical atmosphere had been packed away with the linens and centerpieces, leaving behind an elegant but empty space. The jewelry box was exactly where Emma had said it would be, a small antique piece that had belonged to my mother. I had given it to Emma when she turned 16, wanting to pass down something meaningful from our family's history. Now I was retrieving it like any other forgotten item, running an errand for my daughter's convenience rather than sharing in a meaningful moment. As I drove home with the jewelry box on the passenger seat, I found myself thinking about all the other errands I had run for my children over the years. Picking up dry cleaning when they were too busy, babysitting grandchildren when they wanted date nights, shopping for gifts when they didn't have time, handling various tasks and responsibilities that they could have managed themselves but found it easier to delegate to me. I had always told myself that this was what loving mothers do. We help our children however we can, making their lives easier and more manageable. We sacrifice our own time and energy because their happiness is more important than our convenience. We show love through service, through availability, through never saying no when they need something. But sitting in my driveway with Emma's jewelry box in my hands, I began to wonder if I had confused enabling with loving. Had I taught my children to value me only for what I could do for them rather than who I was as a person? Had I made myself so constantly available that they had never learned to appreciate my presence? Had I loved them so unconditionally that they had never felt the need to earn my affection or respect my feelings? The questions were uncomfortable, but they demanded honest answers. When was the last time one of my children had called just to talk, without needing something from me? When had they last invited me to spend time with them purely for the pleasure of my company? When had they last asked about my hopes, my dreams, my feelings about anything that didn't directly affect them? I couldn't remember. Every interaction in recent years had been transactional, focused on their needs and my ability to meet them. I had become a service provider rather than a person, valued for my function rather than my essence. And I had enabled this transformation by never asking for anything in return, never expecting them to consider my feelings, never demanding the basic respect that should exist in any relationship. The phone rang again that afternoon, and this time it was Sarah. I answered with a mixture of hope and wariness, wondering if this conversation would be different from Emma's perfunctory check-in. "Hi, Mom." Sarah's voice was warm but busy, the tone of someone multitasking while talking. "I just wanted to call and thank you for yesterday. The wedding was beautiful, and I know Emma really appreciated everything you did to help." Again, gratitude for my contributions rather than concern for my experience. Again, acknowledgement of my usefulness without recognition of my feelings. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. "It was a lovely celebration," I replied carefully. "I'm glad you were able to be there for most of it." "Yeah, I'm sorry we had to leave early, but you know how it is with kids. Jacob gets so cranky when he's overstimulated, and we didn't want him to have a meltdown in front of everyone." The excuse sounded reasonable on the surface, but I found myself questioning it in a way I never had before. Jacob was generally a well-behaved child who had been fine during the dinner and early dancing. Sarah and David were experienced parents who could have managed a tired child for another hour or two if they had really wanted to stay. The early departure had been a choice, not a necessity. "Of course," I said, but for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure her that I understood completely. I let a small silence develop, giving her space to say more if she wanted to. Instead, Sarah moved on to her real reason for calling. "Actually, Mom, I was wondering if you could do me a favor. David's parents are coming to visit next weekend, and I promised his mother I'd make that apple pie recipe you taught me, but I can't remember the exact measurements for the crust. Could you email me the recipe?" Another task, another request. For assistance, not an invitation to make the pie together, not a suggestion that I join them for the family visit, just a request for information that would make her life easier. I was being treated like a cookbook rather than a grandmother who might enjoy spending time with visiting in-laws and helping to prepare a special meal. "I'll send it to you today," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Thanks. You're a lifesaver. I have to run now, but I'll call you soon." She hung up quickly, just like Emma had, leaving me with the same hollow feeling of being used rather than loved. 2 conversations in one day, both focused on what I could provide rather than who I was or how I was feeling. 2 interactions that reinforced my growing understanding of how my children really saw me. That evening, Michael called, completing the trilogy of post-wedding check-ins. His conversation followed the same pattern: perfunctory thanks for my help with the wedding, an excuse for leaving early that sounded reasonable but felt calculated, and a request for a favor. In his case, he wanted to know if I could babysit the twins the following weekend, so he and Jennifer could attend a work conference together. 3 children, 3 phone calls, 3 requests for assistance. Not one genuine inquiry about my well-being. Not one expression of interest in my thoughts or feelings about the wedding. Not one invitation to spend time together for the simple pleasure of each other's company. I was being treated like a combination bank account, babysitting service, and personal assistant by the people who should have loved me most. That night, I sat in my living room looking at the family photos that covered the mantelpiece and side tables. Pictures of graduations and weddings, birthday parties and holidays, grandchildren at various stages of growth. Evidence of all the moments I had celebrated, all the milestones I had supported, all the memories I had helped create. But as I studied those images, I realized that in most of them, I was either taking the picture or positioned at the edge of the group. I was the documenter of their happiness, not the central figure in it. I was the supporter of their achievements, not someone whose own accomplishments were celebrated. I was present but peripheral, helpful but not essential. The pattern extended beyond the photographs to the reality of my daily life. My calendar revolved around their schedules, my finances were shaped by their needs, my emotional energy was spent on their problems. But when was the last time they had adjusted their plans to accommodate me? When had they last offered to help with my problems or contribute to my goals? I couldn't remember because it had never happened. Our relationships had become completely one-sided, with me giving and them taking, me accommodating and them expecting, me loving and them tolerating. And I had enabled this dynamic by never asking for more, never expressing dissatisfaction, never making my own needs known. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to start saying no. Not to everything, not out of spite or revenge, but strategically and thoughtfully. I was going to stop being automatically available for every request and start treating my time and energy as valuable resources that needed to be respected. The first test came sooner than expected. Sarah called that afternoon asking if I could babysit Jacob on Thursday evening because their regular sitter had canceled, and they had tickets to a concert they really wanted to attend. In the past, I would have immediately said yes, rearranging whatever plans I had to accommodate their need. Instead, I paused and thought about it. I had plans to attend a book club meeting that evening, something I looked forward to all month. It was one of the few social activities I had that was purely for my own enjoyment, a chance to engage with interesting people about topics that had nothing to do with my children's needs. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I can't that evening," I said, my heart racing at the unfamiliarity of refusing a request. "I have other plans." There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end of the line. Sarah was clearly not used to hearing no from me, and she seemed unsure how to respond. "Oh," she said finally, "what kind of plans?" The question irritated me more than it should have. She was asking not out of genuine interest in my activities, but because she couldn't believe that anything I might be doing could be more important than helping her. She was expecting me to justify my refusal, to prove that my plans were worthy enough to take precedence over her convenience. "I have a book club meeting," I said simply, offering no apology or further explanation. "Couldn't you skip it just this once?" Sarah pressed. "We've had these tickets for months, and I really don't want to miss the concert." There it was, the assumption that my activities were less important than hers, that I should naturally sacrifice my plans for her convenience. The old me would have caved immediately, feeling guilty for disappointing her and finding a way to justify her need as more urgent than my own. But the new me, the one who had been born in the aftermath of Emma's wedding reception, held firm. "I'm sorry, but I won't be available," I repeated. "Perhaps you could find another sitter, or see if David's parents could help." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence, amazed at what I had just done. I had said no to one of my children. I had prioritized my own plans over their convenience. I had refused to automatically accommodate their request without guilt or extensive explanation. It felt both empowering and terrifying. I was proud of myself for finally standing up for my own needs, but I was also afraid of how this might change our relationship. Would Sarah be angry with me? Would she interpret my refusal as a sign that I didn't love her? Would this be the beginning of even more distance between us? But as I thought about it more, I realized that our relationship couldn't get much more distant than it already was. Sarah barely called except when she needed something, rarely visited except during obligatory holidays, and seemed to view me primarily as a convenient resource rather than a beloved family member. What exactly did I have to lose by demanding better treatment? The next few days brought a series of small tests of my newfound resolve. Michael called, asking if I could drive to his house to watch the twins while he ran errands because Jennifer was feeling overwhelmed. I suggested he hire a babysitter or ask Jennifer's mother, who lived equally close. Emma called from her honeymoon asking if I could go to her apartment to water her plants because she had forgotten to arrange for someone to do it. I reminded her that she had given a key to her neighbor specifically for such purposes. Each refusal felt like a small revolution, a quiet assertion of my own value and dignity. I wasn't being mean or vindictive. I was simply declining to automatically sacrifice my time and energy for their convenience. I was asking them to take responsibility for their own problems and find solutions that didn't require my immediate availability. The responses were telling. None of my children expressed concern about whether I was feeling well or going through a difficult time. None of them asked if there was a reason I was less available than usual. They simply seemed annoyed by the inconvenience of having to find alternative solutions to their problems. Their reactions confirmed what I had begun to suspect. They had never really seen me as a person with my own needs, feelings, and priorities. I had been so successful in presenting myself as endlessly available and selflessly devoted that they had genuinely forgotten I might have my own life to live. 2 weeks after Emma's wedding, I made an even more significant decision. I called each of my children and told them I was planning to take a vacation, not to visit them or help with their children, but a real vacation for myself. I was going to spend a week at a cabin in the mountains, reading and hiking and enjoying the solitude. The reactions were remarkably similar. First, surprise that I would want to go anywhere alone. Then, concern about the timing and how it might affect their own plans. Finally, suggestions for how I could modify my vacation to be more helpful to them. Sarah thought I should consider going somewhere closer to her home so I could babysit Jacob while she and David had a weekend getaway. Michael wondered if I could postpone the trip until after his school's fall concert season, when I might be needed to help with the twins. Emma suggested I wait until after she and Marcus returned from their honeymoon so I could house-sit for them while they settled into married life. Not one of them expressed enthusiasm for my plan or happiness that I was doing something purely for my own enjoyment. They saw my vacation as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a positive development to be celebrated. They were concerned about how my absence might affect them, not about whether the trip would bring me joy or fulfillment. I listened to their concerns and suggestions with growing amazement. They actually believed that my life should revolve entirely around their convenience, that I had no right to make plans that didn't consider their needs first. They had become so accustomed to my availability that they couldn't conceive of me having independent desires or goals. "I've already made the reservation," I told each of them firmly. "I'll be leaving next month for a week." The silence that followed these announcements was deafening. They were processing the reality that I was going to do something for myself, regardless of how it affected them, that I was prioritizing my own happiness over their convenience. It was clearly a foreign concept. During the weeks leading up to my vacation, I continued to practice saying no to requests that would have previously been automatic yeses. I declined to host Sunday dinner for 3 weeks running, suggesting that perhaps one of them could take a turn. I refused to babysit on short notice when their regular childcare fell through, reminding them that I had my own schedule to maintain. I stopped responding immediately to every text and phone call, taking time to consider whether the request was reasonable before offering my assistance. The changes were small but cumulative, creating a new dynamic in our relationships. For the first time in decades, my children had to consider my feelings and schedule when making their requests. They had to ask, rather than assume, request rather than demand, appreciate rather than expect. Some of them adapted better than others. Emma seemed genuinely confused by the changes, unable to understand why I was suddenly less available and accommodating. She had grown up taking my sacrifice for granted and had never learned to consider my needs as equal to her own. My newfound boundaries felt like rejection to her, even though I was simply asking for the same consideration she would expect from any other relationship. Michael was more thoughtful in his approach, perhaps because his work as a teacher had taught him about healthy boundaries and mutual respect. He began asking about my availability before making requests, expressing genuine appreciation when I did help, and even occasionally asking about my own plans and interests without needing anything from me. Sarah fell somewhere in between, intellectually understanding that I had the right to my own life, but emotionally struggling with the loss of my constant availability. She had built her own life around the assumption that I would always be there, to fill the gaps, and my new boundaries forced her to develop other support systems and coping strategies. The most surprising discovery was how much I enjoyed having time and energy for my own interests. Without the constant drain of being available for everyone else's needs, I had space to rediscover who I was beyond my role as mother and grandmother. I started reading more, took up watercolor painting, joined a hiking group for seniors, and even began volunteering at the animal shelter. For the first time in decades, I had conversations that weren't about my children's problems or my grandchildren's activities. I met people who knew me as Lisa, not as Sarah's mother or Michael's mother or Emma's mother. I remembered what it felt like to be seen as an individual with my own thoughts, opinions, and experiences worth sharing. The vacation itself was revelatory. A week alone in a mountain cabin with nothing but books, hiking trails, and my own thoughts for company. No phone calls requesting favors, no unexpected visits requiring immediate hosting duties, no crises that demanded my intervention. Just silence and solitude, and the gradual rediscovery of who I was when I wasn't being needed by someone else. I spent hours sitting on the cabin's porch, looking out at the mountains and thinking about the choices I had made over the decades. I grieved for the woman I had been before Robert died, the one with dreams and ambitions that extended beyond caring for other people. I mourned the opportunities I had given up, the friendships I had neglected, the interests I had abandoned in service of my children's needs. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to reclaim some of those abandoned dreams. Hope that I could build a life that was fulfilling on its own terms, not just in relation to my usefulness to others. Hope that my children could learn to value me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. When I returned from vacation, I was surprised to find that my children had managed quite well without me. They had arranged their own childcare, solved their own problems, and handled their own crises. The world had not ended because Lisa Peterson was unavailable for a week. In fact, they had all demonstrated capabilities I had never seen before, because I had always stepped in to handle things for them. The realization was both liberating and sobering. I had spent decades believing that my children needed me, that I was essential to their well-being and happiness. But the truth was that I had made myself indispensable by never giving them the chance to become fully independent. I had enabled their dependence by always being available to solve their problems and meet their needs. Now, as I looked toward the future, I knew that real change was still ahead. My children had gotten a small taste of what life was like when I prioritized my own needs, but they hadn't yet learned the full lesson I needed them to understand. They still saw my new boundaries as temporary inconveniences rather than permanent changes. They still believed that eventually I would return to my old patterns of automatic availability and selfless service. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The woman who had spent 50 years sacrificing herself for their happiness was gone forever. In her place was someone who demanded respect, reciprocity, and genuine affection rather than mere tolerance. Someone who valued her own time and energy as much as theirs. Someone who was finally ready to show them what it meant to truly lose the mother they had taken for granted for so long. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid. I had learned to say no, to prioritize my own needs, to see myself as worthy of consideration and respect. Now it was time to teach my children that love must flow both ways, that relationships require mutual investment, and that taking someone for granted has consequences they were only beginning to understand. The real test of my newfound independence came sooner than I expected. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November when my phone rang at 6:30, startling me awake from a deep sleep. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and my heart immediately began racing with the assumption that something terrible had happened. No one calls at that hour unless there's an emergency. "Mom, thank God you answered." Sarah's voice was strained and panicked. "I'm at the hospital with Jacob. He fell down the stairs at school yesterday and we thought he was fine, but he woke up this morning vomiting and dizzy. The doctors think he might have a concussion." My maternal instincts kicked in immediately, flooding my body with adrenaline and concern. "Oh my goodness, is he going to be okay? What do the doctors say? Do you need me to come?" "They're running tests now, but they want to keep him for observation for at least 24 hours. David had to fly to Chicago yesterday for that big client presentation, and I can't reach him. His phone is going straight to voicemail." Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "Mom, I've been here all night and I'm falling apart. Could you please come stay with me? I just need someone here." The old me would have been dressed and in the car within 10 minutes, racing to the hospital to provide whatever comfort and support my daughter needed. I would have dropped everything without question, cleared my schedule for however long was necessary, and thrown myself completely into crisis management mode. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the memory of Emma's wedding, or the weeks of practicing boundaries, or simply the accumulated weight of years of being taken for granted. Instead of immediately agreeing, I found myself asking questions. "Sarah, have you tried calling Jennifer or any of your friends? What about David's parents? They live closer to the hospital than I do." There was a moment of surprised silence. Sarah clearly hadn't expected me to ask about other options before immediately volunteering myself. "Jennifer has her own kids to deal with, and David's parents are visiting his sister in Florida this week. Mom, I really need you here. Jacob has been asking for his grandmother, and you're so good in situations like this." The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. She was using Jacob's supposed request for me as emotional leverage, appealing to my grandmother instincts while also flattering my crisis management skills. It was a technique that had worked countless times before, making me feel both needed and guilty for any hesitation. But this time, I recognized the pattern. Sarah wasn't asking for my help because I was uniquely qualified to provide it, or because she genuinely wanted my company during a difficult time. She was asking because I was the most convenient option, the one person in her life who had never said no to a request for assistance. "Sweetheart, I understand you're scared and tired," I said carefully, "but I'm not going to be able to come to the hospital today. I have commitments that I can't cancel." The silence that followed was longer this time, heavy with disbelief and growing anger. Commitments? Sarah's voice rose slightly. Mom, your grandson is in the hospital. What could possibly be more important than that? It was a fair question, and the honest answer was complicated. I did have plans that day, but nothing that couldn't technically be rescheduled. I was supposed to have lunch with my book club friends, followed by a pottery class I had been looking forward to all week. Neither activity was urgent or irreplaceable, but that wasn't really the point. The point was that Sarah had automatically assumed I would drop everything for her convenience, without even considering that I might have my own life to live. She had called me before exploring other options, before even trying to handle the situation independently. She had immediately turned to me as the solution to her problem without any thought about the impact on my schedule or well-being. I'm not saying my plans are more important than Jacob's health, I replied, choosing my words carefully. I'm saying that you're a capable adult who can handle this situation without me. You have other people you can call for support, and Jacob is going to be fine whether I'm there or not. I can't believe this, Sarah said, her voice now openly hostile. I'm asking for help during a family emergency, and you're worried about some pottery class? What has gotten into you lately? Ever since Emma's wedding, you've been acting so strange and selfish. The accusation of selfishness stung, but it also clarified something important. In Sarah's mind, any behavior that prioritized my own needs over her convenience was inherently selfish. She had become so accustomed to my automatic availability that she couldn't conceive of legitimate reasons for me to decline her requests. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the hurt and anger building in my chest. But I won't be coming to the hospital today. I hope Jacob feels better soon, and I'm sure you'll handle everything beautifully. I hung up before Sarah could respond, my hands shaking with the adrenaline of conflict. I had just refused to help my daughter during what she characterized as a family emergency. I had chosen my own plans over her expressed need for support. I had done something that the old me would have considered unthinkable. But as I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and processing what had just happened, I realized that I didn't feel guilty. I felt sad that Sarah was dealing with a scary situation alone, concerned about Jacob's well-being and hurt by her angry words. But I didn't feel like I had made the wrong choice. Sarah was a successful lawyer with extensive resources and support systems. She had friends, colleagues, neighbors, and extended family members who could provide the emotional support she needed. She had chosen to call me first, not because I was the best option, but because I was the most reliable one, the person who had never failed to drop everything when summoned. More importantly, her request hadn't really been about needing practical help. The hospital staff was taking care of Jacob, and there wasn't anything I could have done to improve his medical care. Sarah wanted me there to manage her anxiety, to take responsibility for her emotional state during a stressful time. She wanted to transfer the burden of coping with the situation from herself to me. I had been enabling this pattern for decades, rushing to my children's side whenever they faced challenges, and taking on their emotional labor as if it were my own. I had taught them to see me as a solution to their problems, rather than as a person with my own limitations and needs. I had made myself indispensable to their emotional well-being while never asking them to consider mine. That afternoon, I went to my pottery class as planned. As I worked with the clay, shaping it slowly and carefully on the wheel, I thought about the conversation with Sarah and what it revealed about our relationship. She had been genuinely shocked by my refusal to help, unable to comprehend that I might have priorities beyond her immediate needs. It occurred to me that in all the years since my children had become adults, none of them had ever asked me what I needed during my own difficult times. When I had been sick with pneumonia 2 years ago, they had called to check on me but hadn't offered to bring groceries or help with household tasks. When I had been struggling with depression after the death of my closest friend, they had listened sympathetically, but hadn't suggested ways they could provide support. They had learned to see me as a source of strength and assistance, not as someone who might occasionally need care herself. I had trained them to believe that my role was to give while theirs was to receive, that my problems were less significant than theirs, that my emotional needs were less urgent than their own. The pottery class was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. There was something deeply satisfying about creating something beautiful with my own hands, about focusing entirely on the present moment without worrying about anyone else's needs or expectations. The other students were friendly and interested in getting to know me as an individual, not as someone's mother or grandmother. When I returned home that evening, there were 3 voicemail messages waiting for me. The first was from Sarah, left around noon, her voice cold and formal. "Mom, I just wanted to let you know that Jacob is doing better. The tests came back normal, and the doctors say he can go home tomorrow. David finally called me back and is flying home early. I managed to handle everything myself, as you suggested I could." The message was clearly intended to make me feel guilty, with its emphasis on her successful independence and David's eventual assistance. But instead of guilt, I felt pride. Sarah had indeed handled everything herself, proving that she was perfectly capable of managing a crisis without my intervention. The second message was from Michael, his voice concerned and slightly confused. "Mom, Sarah called me about Jacob and mentioned that you couldn't come to the hospital today. She seemed pretty upset about it. Is everything okay? It's not like you to miss a family emergency. Call me back when you can." The third message was from Emma, newly returned from her honeymoon and clearly briefed by Sarah about my supposed failing as a grandmother. "Hi, Mom, it's Emma. I heard about Jacob and that you weren't able to help Sarah today. I'm sure you had your reasons, but I have to say I'm a little surprised. Sarah really needed support, and you've always been there for us before. Anyway, call me back. We need to talk." The 3 messages painted a clear picture of how my children had processed my refusal to immediately accommodate Sarah's request. They saw it as an aberration, a temporary lapse in my usual reliability that needed to be investigated and corrected. None of them had considered that my behavior might represent a permanent change in our relationship dynamics. I decided not to return the calls immediately. For the first time in decades, I was going to make my children wait for my response rather than rushing to manage their concerns and expectations. I was going to take time to consider what I wanted to say rather than automatically providing reassurance and explanation. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Michael. I was in my garden, enjoying the crisp November air while cleaning up the last of the fallen leaves when his car pulled into my driveway. He got out looking worried and determined, clearly on a mission to understand what was happening with his previously predictable mother. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, continuing to rake leaves as he approached. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said without preamble. "Sarah told me about yesterday, and frankly, I'm concerned. It's not like you to refuse help when one of us is in trouble." I leaned on my rake and studied my son's face. He looked genuinely worried, but there was also an undertone of annoyance that reminded me of his childhood tantrums when things didn't go according to his expectations. "I'm perfectly fine, Michael. I simply had other commitments yesterday that I chose not to cancel." "But Jacob was in the hospital," he pressed. "Sarah needed you, and you chose a pottery class over being there for your family." The way he framed it made my choice sound trivial and heartless, reducing my legitimate right to my own schedule to a selfish preference for recreation over responsibility. It was the same technique Sarah had used, attempting to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own needs. "Sarah needed someone to hold her hand while she waited for test results," I corrected gently. The hospital staff was taking excellent care of Jacob, and there was nothing I could have done to improve his medical treatment. Sarah is a grown woman who is perfectly capable of handling stressful situations without her mother managing her emotions for her. Michael's expression shifted from concern to confusion to something approaching irritation. "Since when do you talk about us like we're burdens. We're your children. Helping us is what mothers do. There it was, the assumption that had governed our relationships for decades. My children genuinely believed that being their mother meant I was obligated to prioritize their needs above my own, that my role was to provide unlimited support without expecting anything in return. They saw my availability as a natural law rather than a choice I had made out of love. Helping you is something I choose to do when it's appropriate and when I'm able, I said, setting down my rake and giving Michael my full attention. But I'm not obligated to drop everything every time one of you faces a challenge. You're all adults with your own resources and support systems. Resources and support systems? Michael repeated, his voice rising. Mom, you're talking about us like we're strangers. We're your family. Family is supposed to be there for each other. The irony of his statement was almost overwhelming. For decades, I had been there for them in every possible way. But when had they been there for me? When had they dropped their plans to support me through a difficult time? When had they made themselves available when I needed emotional support or practical assistance? You're absolutely right that families should be there for each other, I agreed. But that has to work both ways. I've spent 50 years being there for all of you, but I can't remember the last time any of you made a significant sacrifice to be there for me. Michael looked genuinely shocked by this observation, as if the idea that I might need support had never occurred to him. But Mom, you never ask for help. You always seem so capable and independent. I learned to be capable and independent because I had to be, I replied. After your father died, I didn't have the luxury of falling apart or depending on other people to solve my problems. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't have appreciated knowing that you cared about my well-being as much as I care about yours. We stood there in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, Michael clearly struggling to process this new perspective on our family dynamics. He had grown up taking my strength and availability for granted, never considering that I might have my own vulnerabilities and needs. I don't understand what's happening here, he said finally. Ever since Emma's wedding, you've been different, distant, less available. It's like you don't care about us anymore. The accusation hurt, but it also revealed how little my children actually understood about love and relationships. They equated caring with constant availability, love with unlimited sacrifice. They couldn't conceive of a relationship where boundaries and mutual respect coexisted with genuine affection. I love you all more than you'll ever know, I said quietly. But love doesn't mean I have to make myself smaller so you can feel bigger. It doesn't mean I have to sacrifice my own well-being for your convenience. It doesn't mean I have to be available every time you decide you need me. Then what does it mean? Michael asked, his voice containing a note of desperation that made him sound like the confused little boy he had once been. It was a good question, one that deserved a thoughtful answer. I had spent so many years defining love through service and sacrifice that I was only beginning to understand what healthy love might look like. It means wanting what's best for each other, even when that's not the easiest thing, I said slowly. It means respecting each other's boundaries and choices. It means being there for each other during genuine emergencies, but also understanding that not every problem is an emergency. It means caring about each other's happiness and well-being, not just when it's convenient. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller and more vulnerable than it had been since he was a child. I guess I never thought about what you might need from us. You always seemed so strong and together. I never imagined you might want us to take care of you sometimes. It was the first hint of understanding I had heard from any of my children. The first acknowledgement that our relationship might be unbalanced. It gave me hope that Michael, at least, might be capable of growth and change. I don't need you to take care of me, I said gently. But I would like to feel valued for who I am, not just what I can do for you. I would like to feel like my thoughts and feelings matter to you. I would like to spend time together sometimes just because you enjoy my company. not because you need something from me. That conversation with Michael marked a turning point in my understanding of what I was trying to accomplish. It wasn't enough to simply set boundaries and refuse unreasonable requests. I needed to help my children understand what I was really asking for: genuine relationship based on mutual respect and affection, rather than one-sided service and obligation. Over the following weeks, I began having similar conversations with Sarah and Emma, though their reactions were quite different from Michael's thoughtful consideration. Sarah became defensive and argumentative, insisting that she had always appreciated me and that my complaints were unfair and hurtful. Emma seemed confused and hurt, unable to understand why I was suddenly dissatisfied with relationships that had worked perfectly well for everyone involved. The resistance I encountered from Sarah and Emma clarified something important about the challenge I was facing. They weren't just accustomed to my unlimited availability. They felt entitled to it. They believed that having given birth to them and raised them gave them permanent claim on my time, energy, and resources. They saw my new boundaries not as reasonable self-care, but as a violation of the fundamental contract of motherhood. It was during this period of difficult conversations and growing tension that the situation that would change everything began to develop. I had been experiencing some troubling symptoms for several weeks: persistent fatigue, occasional dizziness, and a nagging pain in my chest that I kept attributing to stress and aging. I had been planning to make a doctor's appointment, but between the drama with my children and my new social activities, I kept putting it off. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in early December. I was at home preparing dinner when I suddenly felt overwhelmingly dizzy and nauseous. The chest pain intensified dramatically, and I found myself struggling to breathe. I recognized the symptoms immediately. I was having a heart attack. My first instinct was to call 911, which I did with shaking hands as I sank into a chair in my kitchen. The dispatcher was calm and professional, walking me through the steps of taking aspirin and unlocking my front door for the paramedics. As I waited for help to arrive, fighting waves of pain and fear, I found myself thinking about my children. This was the kind of genuine emergency that should bring a family together. This was when loving children would drop everything to rush to their mother's side, when past grievances would be forgotten in the face of real crisis. This was when I would finally see whether my children loved me enough to be there when I truly needed them. The paramedics arrived quickly and efficiently transported me to the hospital, where I was immediately taken into emergency cardiac care. The next several hours were a blur of tests and procedures, doctors and nurses working to stabilize my condition and assess the damage to my heart. By late evening, I was stable, but exhausted, lying in a hospital bed with monitors beeping around, me and an IV drip feeding medication into my arm. It was only then that I realized I hadn't called my children to tell them what was happening. The hospital staff had asked about emergency contacts, and I had provided their numbers. But in my pain and fear, I hadn't thought to reach out to them myself. I had been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis that I hadn't considered how my children would want to be involved. Around 10 o'clock that night, a nurse came to check on me and mentioned that the hospital had called my emergency contacts to inform them of my condition. She seemed surprised that none of them had arrived yet, given that I lived in the same general area as all 3 children. "Sometimes it takes people a while to process this kind of news," she said kindly. "I'm sure they'll be here soon." But as the hours passed and visiting hours ended without any sign of my children, I began to realize that they weren't coming. Not that night anyway. Whatever their reasons, they had received word that their mother was in the hospital after a heart attack, and they had chosen not to immediately rush to my bedside. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just weeks ago, Sarah had expected me to drop everything and race to the hospital because Jacob had fallen down some stairs and might have a mild concussion. She had been outraged when I suggested she could handle the situation without me. But now, when their mother had suffered a potentially life-threatening cardiac event, they were apparently too busy or too angry or too something to show up. I spent that long night alone in the hospital room, listening to the steady beep of heart monitors and thinking about what this absence revealed about my relationships with my children. They had become so accustomed to my strength and availability that they couldn't imagine me actually needing them. They had taken my health and presence so completely for granted that even a heart attack wasn't enough to motivate immediate concern. Or perhaps they were staying away deliberately, using my medical crisis as an opportunity to punish me for my recent boundary setting and refusal to automatically accommodate their requests. Maybe they thought that a night alone in the hospital would teach me a lesson about the consequences of being less available to them. Either way, their absence was telling me everything I needed to know about how they really felt about me. When push came to shove, when I truly needed them to show up for me the way I had always shown up for them, they simply weren't there. The next morning brought visits from 2 of my 3 children, but their behavior only confirmed my worst fears about our relationship dynamics. Sarah arrived around 10, looking harried and slightly annoyed, immediately launching into explanations about how she couldn't stay long because she had a court appearance that afternoon. "How are you feeling?" she asked, but before I could answer completely, she was already checking her phone and talking about her schedule. It was clear that she was there out of obligation rather than genuine concern, fulfilling the minimum requirement of showing up without actually being present. Emma arrived an hour later, tearful and dramatic, full of apologies for not coming the night before. But her explanation revealed the same self-centered thinking that had characterized all our recent interactions. "I was so scared when the hospital called," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I just couldn't handle the thought of seeing you like this. Marcus had to talk me into coming at all. You know how hospitals upset me." She was making my heart attack about her own emotional comfort, asking me to understand and forgive her absence because dealing with my medical crisis was too difficult for her to handle. She wanted sympathy for how hard my illness was on her, rather than offering support for what I was going through. Michael never came at all. When I asked Sarah about him, she said he was dealing with a crisis at work and would try to visit over the weekend. A work crisis that was more important than his mother's heart attack. The message was clear. I ranked below his professional obligations in his list of priorities. As I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by evidence of my children's indifference and neglect, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The last vestiges of hope I had been carrying, the belief that somewhere underneath their selfishness, they truly loved me, finally died. I realized that I had spent 50 years pouring my heart and soul into relationships that were fundamentally one-sided, caring for people who saw me as useful but not valuable, necessary but not beloved. It was in that moment of absolute clarity, surrounded by beeping machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant, that I made the decision that would change everything. I was done trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I was done accepting crumbs of attention from children who should have been grateful for everything I had sacrificed for them. I was done being taken for granted by the people who should have treasured me most. When I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later, I drove straight to my lawyer's office. It was time for my children to learn that actions have consequences, that taking someone for granted has a price, and that love withdrawn is love lost forever. It was time for them to discover what their mother was really worth, and what it would cost them to have treated her like she was worth nothing at all. The woman who had spent her whole life putting her children's needs before her own was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally understood her own value. And if my children couldn't appreciate that value while I was alive, then perhaps they would understand it when I was gone. Harold Brennan had been my attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from Robert's estate when he died to the refinancing of my mortgage in the early 2000s. He was a kind man in his late 60s, with silver hair and gentle eyes that had seen families through their worst moments and their most important decisions. When I called his office requesting an urgent appointment to update my will, his secretary squeezed me in that same afternoon. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by law books and family photographs, and told him exactly what I wanted to do. Harold listened without judgment as I explained my decision to remove my children as beneficiaries of my estate, replacing them with charitable organizations and my longtime housekeeper, Maria, who had shown me more genuine care in the past 5 years than my own children had managed in decades. "Lisa, I have to ask," Harold said gently when I finished outlining my wishes. "Are you certain about this decision? It's quite a dramatic change from your previous will, and these kinds of choices are difficult to undo once you're gone." Had expected this question, and had spent considerable time thinking about my answer. "Harold, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. My children have made it abundantly clear that they value me only for what I can provide them, not for who I am as a person. They've shown me through their actions that they consider me a convenient resource rather than a beloved family member." Harold made notes on his legal pad, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Have you considered the possibility that they might change? That this could be a wake-up call for them to appreciate you more?" It was a fair question, one that touched on the small part of me that still hoped my children might somehow transform into the loving, respectful adults I had always dreamed they would become. But hope without evidence is just wishful thinking, and the evidence of their character was overwhelming. "They had 50 years to learn to appreciate me," I said quietly. "They had countless opportunities to show genuine interest in my well-being, to treat me with the respect I deserved, to demonstrate that they valued our relationship beyond what I could do for them. The fact that they chose not to take those opportunities tells me everything I need to know about who they really are." Harold nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "What about your grandchildren? They'll be affected by this decision too, even though they had no part in creating this situation. This was the part of my decision that caused me the most anguish. I loved Jacob and the twins and Emma's little girl with all my heart, but I had learned through painful experience that my relationships with them were entirely controlled by their parents, limited to whatever contact Sarah, Michael, and Emma deemed appropriate. If I couldn't have genuine relationships with my grandchildren while I was alive, I couldn't create them from beyond the grave through financial inheritance. The grandchildren will inherit whatever their parents choose to give them from their own estates," I replied. "But I won't reward my children's treatment of me by leaving them money they can use or withhold from their children as they see fit. If Sarah, Michael, and Emma want their children to benefit from my estate, they should have treated me better while they had the chance." Harold spent the next hour carefully documenting my wishes, ensuring that the new will would be legally sound and impossible to contest. I was leaving the bulk of my estate to 3 charities: a local organization that provided support for widowed women, a scholarship fund for students whose parents had died young, and an animal rescue that I had been volunteering with since my transformation began. Maria, my housekeeper, would receive a substantial sum along with ownership of my house. She had been cleaning for me twice a week for 5 years, but more importantly, she had become a genuine friend. She remembered my birthday without being reminded, asked about my health with real concern, and listened to my stories about the past with authentic interest. She treated me with the kind of respect and affection I had always hoped to receive from my own children. The most important part of the new will was the letter I was writing to be read to my children after my death. This letter would explain exactly why they had been disinherited, detailing the specific behaviors and attitudes that had led to my decision. I wanted them to understand that their inheritance hadn't been lost through some arbitrary whim or temporary anger, but through their own choices and actions over many years. Writing that letter was both cathartic and heartbreaking. I found myself reliving decades of small slights and major disappointments, patterns of behavior that I had excused or ignored at the time, but that now formed a clear picture of how my children really saw me. The letter grew longer as I documented specific examples of their selfishness, their lack of consideration for my feelings, their assumption that I existed solely to serve their needs. But I also wrote about my love for them, about the joy they had brought me when they were young, about the pride I had felt watching them grow into accomplished adults. I wanted them to understand that my decision came from a place of hurt rather than hatred, that I was not punishing them out of spite, but responding to their treatment of me with appropriate consequences. The process of creating the new will took several weeks, with multiple revisions as I clarified my thoughts and ensured that every detail was legally binding. During this time, my children seemed to have moved past their irritation about my boundary setting and returned to their normal patterns of occasional contact. They called when they needed something, sent perfunctory texts on holidays, and generally behaved as if our recent conflicts had been resolved simply by being ignored. Their assumption that things had returned to normal only reinforced my conviction that I was making the right choice. They had learned nothing from our confrontations, changed nothing about their behavior, and apparently believed that they could simply wait out my newfound assertiveness until I returned to my old patterns of unlimited availability. Sarah called in January asking if I could babysit Jacob for a long weekend, while she and David took a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. When I declined, citing my own plans to visit a friend in another state, she seemed genuinely surprised that I would prioritize a social visit over her childcare needs. The fact that she had given me less than a week's notice and had made her travel arrangements before checking my availability didn't seem to occur to her as problematic. Michael reached out in February, requesting a loan to help with the down payment on a larger house. He presented it as a family investment opportunity, suggesting that I would eventually get my money back with interest. But when I asked about the specific terms of repayment and requested that we formalize the arrangement, with a written agreement, he became defensive and accused me of not trusting him. The conversation ended with him hanging up in frustration when I refused to simply write him a check based on his verbal promise to repay me someday. Emma's request came in March, just before my 74th birthday. She wanted me to help plan and pay for an elaborate anniversary party for her and Marcus, suggesting that it would be a wonderful way for me to show my support for their marriage. When I pointed out that anniversary parties are typically hosted by the couple themselves or their friends, not their parents, she seemed confused by my reluctance to take on the project. Each of these interactions followed the same pattern that had characterized our relationships for years. My children approached me with requests that assumed my automatic agreement, became confused or annoyed when I asked questions or expressed hesitation, and ultimately interpreted my boundaries as evidence of my failure to love them properly, rather than their failure to treat me respectfully. Their inability to learn from our conflicts, to modify their behavior based on my clearly expressed needs, convinced me that they were fundamentally incapable of the kind of relationship I had been hoping for. They saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished, and no amount of boundary setting or honest communication was going to change that reality. As spring turned to summer, I began experiencing symptoms that suggested my heart condition was worsening. The cardiologist adjusted my medications and recommended some lifestyle changes, but made it clear that my long-term prognosis was uncertain. The knowledge that my time might be limited added urgency to my decision-making and helped me focus on what really mattered during whatever years I had left. I threw myself into activities that brought me genuine joy and fulfillment. I took art classes and learned to paint watercolor landscapes that captured the beauty I saw in everyday moments. I joined a hiking group for seniors and discovered muscles I hadn't used in decades as we explored local trails and nature preserves. I volunteered more regularly at the animal shelter, finding deep satisfaction in caring for creatures who appreciated kindness without taking it for granted. Most importantly, I cultivated friendships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. My book club friends became genuine companions who shared my interests and respected my opinions. Maria and I developed a relationship that went far beyond housekeeper and employer, spending time together cooking traditional recipes from her homeland and sharing stories about our very different but surprisingly parallel experiences as women who had learned to be strong in the face of adversity. These new relationships showed me what I had been missing in my interactions with my children. When my friends called, they wanted to hear about my day, my thoughts, my experiences, They remembered details about my life and asked follow-up questions that showed they had been genuinely listening during our previous conversations. They made plans with me because they enjoyed my company, not because they needed something from me. The contrast was stark and painful. My own children, who had benefited from decades of my love and sacrifice, treated me with less consideration and respect than people I had known for months rather than years. The people who should have known me best seemed to know me least, while relative strangers took the time to understand and appreciate who I was as an individual. By the fall of that year, my new will was complete and properly executed, with copies safely stored in Harold's office and my home safe. I felt a sense of peace and completion that I hadn't experienced in years. I had taken control of my legacy, ensuring that my assets would go to people and organizations that would appreciate and make good use of them, rather than to children who had shown they couldn't be trusted to value what they received. The letter to my children was finished as well, sealed in an envelope with instructions for Harold to read it aloud to them when they came to his office for the reading of the will. I had chosen my words carefully, wanting to be honest about their failures without being needlessly cruel, to explain my reasoning without leaving room for misinterpretation. I wrote about the specific moments that had shown me how little they valued our relationship. Emma's wedding reception and the casual dismissal that followed. Sarah's fury when I refused to drop everything for Jacob's minor medical incident. Michael's complete absence during my heart attack, and countless smaller examples of their thoughtless treatment over the years. But I also wrote about my love for them, about the babies they had been, and the hope I had carried that they would grow into adults who could love me back with the same intensity I had always felt for them. I explained that my decision wasn't born of anger but of sadness, that I wasn't trying to hurt them but simply refusing to continue enabling their selfishness. The most important part of the letter was my hope that they would learn from this experience, that losing their inheritance might teach them to value the people in their lives more deeply and treat their relationships with greater care. I couldn't change the way they had treated me, but perhaps my final lesson could prevent them from making the same mistakes with their own children or other important people in their lives. As my 74th birthday approached in December, I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed since my transformation began. It had been the most difficult period of my adult life in many ways, forcing me to confront painful truths about my relationships and make choices that went against every maternal instinct I possessed. But it had also been liberating in ways I couldn't have imagined. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself rather than for other people's expectations. I was pursuing my own interests, forming relationships based on mutual respect, and experiencing the satisfaction of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. My children called on my birthday, each with brief, cheerful conversations that felt more like obligations being fulfilled than genuine expressions of love. Sarah mentioned that Jacob had made me a card at school but forgot to bring it when she called. Michael promised to take me to dinner soon, but didn't suggest any specific plans. Emma talked mostly about her own life and ended the conversation by asking if I could help her with holiday shopping for Marcus's family. Their calls confirmed what I already knew. They saw my birthday as an item on their to-do lists rather than a celebration of someone they loved. They were going through the motions of being dutiful children without actually investing any emotional energy or genuine care in our interactions. After the last call ended, I sat in my living room looking at the family photos that still covered my mantelpiece and side tables. In most of those pictures, I was smiling, surrounded by children and grandchildren who looked happy and loved. But I realized now that many of those smiles had been performed rather than felt, created for the camera rather than arising from genuine joy. I wasn't the same woman who appeared in those photographs, the one who had believed that loving unconditionally meant accepting any treatment her children chose to give her. That woman had been naive about the nature of relationships, believing that sacrifice alone could create the bonds she craved. She had confused enabling with nurturing, submission with love. The woman I had become understood that healthy relationships require boundaries, that love must be mutual to be sustainable, that respect has to be earned even within families. I had learned to value myself enough to demand better treatment, to walk away from relationships that diminished rather than enriched my life. That winter passed quietly, with my children following their usual patterns of minimal contact, punctuated by requests for assistance that I continued to decline. They seemed to have accepted my new boundaries as a permanent but manageable inconvenience, adjusting their expectations without fundamentally changing their attitudes toward our relationship. By spring, my health was noticeably declining. The cardiologist was frank about my prognosis, explaining that my heart was weakening and that I should consider my affairs in order. I wasn't dying immediately, but I probably had months rather than years remaining. The knowledge of my mortality brought a strange sort of peace. I had lived long enough to understand what my children were and weren't capable of giving me. I had taken control of my legacy and ensured that my assets would go to people who would appreciate them. I had experienced genuine friendship and respect in my final years, learning what I had been missing in my relationships with my children. Most importantly, I had taught myself to value my own worth independent of other people's recognition. I had learned to find happiness and fulfillment through my own efforts rather than through other people's approval. I had discovered that it's never too late to demand the treatment you deserve, even if it means walking away from relationships that no longer serve you. The end came in early summer, on a quiet Tuesday morning when I was sitting in my garden enjoying the roses that Robert had planted so many years ago. I felt the familiar chest pain and shortness of breath, but this time I knew that no amount of medication or medical intervention was going to help. This was my time to go. I called Harold's office to remind him about the will and the letter, wanting to ensure that my final wishes would be carried out exactly as I had planned. Then I called Maria to tell her how much her friendship had meant to me, and to let her know about the inheritance that would soon be hers. Finally, I sat back, in my garden chair, and waited for the paramedics I had called to arrive. I died 2 days later in the hospital, surrounded by the medical staff who had tried so hard to save me, but without any of my children at my bedside. They had been notified of my condition, but apparently none of them had felt urgency about saying goodbye to the mother who had given them everything and asked for so little in return. The reading of my will took place the following week in Harold's office. Sarah, Michael, and Emma arrived expecting to learn about their inheritance, probably already making plans for how they would divide my assets and dispose of my belongings. They had never doubted that they would be the primary beneficiaries of my estate, despite years of treating me like an inconvenience rather than a treasure. Harold began by reading the letter I had written, his voice steady and professional as he delivered my final words to the children who had broken my heart. I could only imagine their shock as they listened to my catalog of their failures, my explanation of why they had been disinherited, my hope that they would learn to treat the people they loved with greater care and respect. When Harold finished reading the will itself, explaining that my estate would go to charity and to Maria rather than to them, their shock must have been overwhelming. They had expected to inherit a substantial sum, including my house and investments, and the life insurance policy that had grown considerably over the decades since Robert's death. Instead, they received nothing but the knowledge that their mother had died disappointed in them, hurt by their treatment of her, convinced that they were incapable of the kind of love she had always hoped to receive from them. They learned that the woman who had sacrificed everything for their happiness had ultimately concluded that they didn't deserve her sacrifice. I hoped that the shock would serve as a wake-up call, that losing their inheritance might motivate them to examine their behavior and treat their own children and other important people in their lives with greater consideration. I hoped that my final lesson would prevent them from creating the same pain in their own families that they had created in mine. But whether they learned from this experience or simply felt angry and victimized was no longer my concern. I had done what I could to teach them about love and respect during my lifetime. If they chose not to learn those lessons, that was their choice to make and their consequences to bear. My legacy would live on through the charities that would use my money to help other widowed women, to educate young people who had lost their parents, and to care for animals who needed protection. It would live on through Maria, who would use her inheritance to create a better life for herself and her family. It would live on through the friends who had learned to value genuine relationships through their connection with me. Most importantly, my legacy would live on through the example I had set in my final years, when I learned to value myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. I had shown that it's never too late to change the dynamics of a relationship, never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to choose dignity over convenience. The children I had loved so completely had taught me, through their neglect and disrespect, that unconditional love is meaningless when it flows in only one direction. They had shown me that enabling bad behavior in the name of love actually damages relationships rather than strengthening them. They had demonstrated that taking someone for granted has consequences, even when that someone is your mother. In the end, I had given them the greatest gift I could, the opportunity to learn that love and respect must be mutual to be meaningful, that relationships require investment from both parties to thrive, and that treating people well is not optional, but essential to maintaining connections that matter. Whether they would accept that gift and learn from it was up to them. But I had done my part, teaching my final and most important lesson about the true nature of love, respect, and family. The woman who had spent her life being taken for granted had found a way to ensure that she would never be forgotten and that her children would always remember the cost of their indifference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.